Okay, well, hello everybody. Welcome to our massive discussion with Maher Mughrabi. It's my pleasure and privilege to be introducing Maher Mughrabi, who is the features editor for The Age and has worked as foreign affairs editor for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, during which time they won 4 Walkley Awards, including a Golden Walkley for reporting from Mosul during the liberation of the so-called Islamic State. Maher has been at this game for many, many years. I've had the privilege of knowing him, bouncing off ideas. He has worked with The Independent, with The Scotsman, Daily Mail, and Khalij Times. 3 years ago, in 2013, Maher published a piece exploring, reflecting really on what's happened in Egypt following the coup when General Sisi overthrew a democratically elected government. And he called the piece the Hunting Leviathan in the Middle East, published in Arena Journal. And I think it's good for us to revisit the ideas behind that piece and really explore how he sees the developments in the Middle East, the sectarian conflict, authoritarianism, dictatorship, and prospects of democracy, let's be positive, in the region. And of course, I am very keen to also talk about and discuss the Australian media's reporting of the Middle East. So without further ado, I'll invite Maher to say a few opening remarks, and then I'll have a few questions, and we will also have a chance to have Q&A from the floor. So Maher, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Shahram. So I'd like to make a couple of things clear before I start talking about these many issues. The first thing I would like to make clear is that, as Shahram says, I've been with The Age now for 16 years. I've been in journalism for 25 years. But what you're going to hear today is very much my personal assessment. It's not the editorial position of The Age or the Sydney Morning Herald or Nine Network, who are my new masters. It's my position. It's a position that is probably a little bit unusual in a newsroom here, but then that comes out of the difference in my perspective, I think, as someone who grew up in the Western world, but who was always exposed at home and in his daily life to an Arab perspective, to a Middle Eastern perspective. The second thing I would say is that although some people are kind enough to talk about me in this way, I am not an academic. I don't spend a great deal of time researching and studying, or not nearly as much as I would like to. I work in the world of news. I work in the world of newspaper journalism, and until 3 years ago, I worked in the business of daily deadlines, which means that my chances to look up and see the wider picture were quite limited. Now I'm working to 2 deadlines a week, both of them on a Friday. That means I do have a little more time for reflection, but not anything like the amount of time that I think is needed to expand upon some of the themes I'm going to talk about today. That being said, this piece was published in 2015, but I started trying to write it in 2013 because I was so tired of the media narrative that had developed around the events in the Middle East between 2011 and 2013. And I think that that's very important for you to understand, is that the framework for what I'm going to put forward as my understanding of what's happening comes directly out of my work in foreign news. First, watching the so-called Arab Spring take hold, then watching it spread across the region, and then watching it collapse into wars, into sort of false starts, if you like, and controversy, and watching it being subsumed by larger power struggles. I read recently this piece, which is also from around that time, by a woman called Julia El-Yashar, who teaches at the University of California. And she said at one point, it's called Upending Infrastructure. It's about Egypt specifically, about Tamarrud and the period in 2013 when Tamarrud brought thousands of people out onto the streets to call for the end of the Muslim Brotherhood government, the democratically elected Muslim Brotherhood government. And at one point she said in the piece, the establishment of narrative becomes a problem. And I had to laugh. And then she said something which I thought was even more important, especially in Western newsrooms, which is that in the absence of a properly thought out narrative, what I find is often recruited to fill the gap is explanations that rely very heavily on cultural ideas about people from the Middle East, about what kind of people Middle Eastern people are. It never seems to occur to some of these people that there are all kinds of Middle Eastern people, not just one kind. But the other thing that is often recruited to fill the gap are explanations of religion, based in religion and based in the sectarian idea, which I don't think stand up to close scrutiny. I particularly get very, very tired of being told that what is happening can be understood, and I say this in the essay that I first wrote, in terms of Sunni and Shia and the history of the relations between these two sects. There is too much that doesn't fit into that scheme for me to accept it. And I think that these frameworks that are recruited, as I say, to explain what is going on, have to them an immutability and a counter-humanist quality, I would say, that always worries me. And by counter-humanist, I mean that they tend to deal in polarities and binaries, which I think is very misleading. And at that point, I want to read something to you that was written by the great Egyptian author and Nobel laureate Naguib Mahfouz. It's very short. It's a short comment that he gave to an editor at Al-Ahram. And he said, "Decades ago, Cairo was a collection of small neighborhoods, each of which was in a constant state of mutation, splintering into ever smaller entities. Each entity was a small world unto itself, and each had a neighborhood tough, a strong man, whose fortunes depended on how well he could conduct himself in a fight. He was called the Futuwa, and Futuwas knew a thing or two about loyalty. They were not mobsters, for they had a deep sense of belonging to their community and a natural impulse to protect it. Back then, streets would occasionally enter into rivalries, much in the way that football fans do today. A feud would suddenly erupt between two alleys, and the Futuwa would spring into action. But Futuwa were not the only strong men around. Occasionally, the Baltajis would take over. And these people were nothing but plain thugs. They were mobsters and racketeers. The business in which the Baltajis would indulge involved the collection of protection money, accompanied with threats of menace from small merchants. Their technique to ensure the continued payment of this protection money was to ensure that the locals lived their lives in a state of continual fear. They were, in short, nothing more than oppressors. And because of this, it was absolutely necessary that they be stood up to, and when necessary, fought with. Which brings me to my point, Mahfouz says. Is it not sad that the international scene appears today to be dominated by Baltajis, and where, one wonders, are the Futuwa to keep them in check? Now, I have to tell you, when I read this, Mahfouz always astounds you, I find. You always are amazed by his insight. But for once, and I read this around the time that the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood government was collapsing, I thought to myself, he has left something very important out. And what had been left out, to my mind, as I say, I talk about binaries, polarities, was that here, the situation in these alleys, and I don't think it's too much of a stretch to see the Middle East now as a series of small, splintered neighborhoods, is cast in terms of the Fatuwa, who are loyal and selfless and good, and the people trust them, and so on. And Baltajis, thugs who oppress the people, keep them in a state of fear, are hated, etc., etc. But to me, looking at the Leviathan, the sort of great body made up of the bodies of the assembled people within the political entity, which is why I called it Hunting Leviathan. Everybody is looking for this. Everybody is looking for this kind of corporeal realization of safety, of power. It struck me when I was thinking about Mahfouz and thinking about Hobbes as well, that sometimes the Baltaji and the Fatuwa are one and the same entity viewed from two different perspectives. So what seems to an Egyptian who supported the January the 25th revolution as the Fatuwa Abdel Fattah Sisi, who has risen to defend Egypt and save Egypt from the people who want to destroy Egypt, is also at the same time, one and the same time, the Baltaji, the thug who keeps people afraid, who puts people in jail, who tortures people. And one can do this for all the leaders of the region, I think. But what I would say on top of that is that the Leviathan here, as Hobbes understood it, was an entity to which people gave some of their own freedom in return for the guarantee of safety. Now, to me, when people say, oh, there was an Arab Spring, and then it went wrong, and now the Islamists are everywhere, this is not quite what happened. What happened, to my mind, is that the people said, we need an entity like this, a strong entity, to which we are willing to give up some of our rights, provided it guarantees our well-being. But then they reached a point where they felt, no, this is simply not guaranteeing our well-being, so we have to take it upon ourselves to try and fashion this entity. At that point, they put themselves in conflict with the class they had previously looked to for that stability. And then that class engaged in a backlash against them and said, no, you still are wrong. You still don't have what it takes to constitute this Leviathan. We do, and we will, and we will. So we are now in an arm wrestle between those two classes of people. To me, the Islamists in this picture are a much more opportunistic phenomenon. They are not central to it. The struggle centrally, from my perspective, is between the population who want a strong state, I think. I don't think they don't want a strong state. They do want a strong state, but they want to be the ones who constitute that strength. And those above them who want to decide what strength is and that they will constitute it. They will be the ones who have input. And to give you one example that struck me very recently, and sometimes the strength that people want to constitute is Islamist strength, but not always. Recently, when Trump started talking about his Middle East economic discussion in Bahrain, I was reminded of Naftali Bennett, who is now not in the Israeli parliament, but who was for a time a star in that parliament. And he talked about a stability plan for the Palestinians. And the really nifty thing about the stability plan of Naftali Bennett was that it didn't require Palestinian consent to work. Right? And this is what the Trump-Kushner plan is like. It doesn't require Palestinian consent in order to work. When some interviewer said to Kushner, do you think the Palestinians trust you? He said, it's not about being trusted. Trust is not necessary because they either take it or leave it. If they accept the terms, then I don't need them to trust me. If they don't accept the terms, I don't need them to trust me either. Right? And this is the position of the ruling class in the Arab world now. The Prince Mohammed bin Salmans, the Bashar al-Assads, all of these people. They want to constitute the Leviathan, but without reference to the people who would normally constitute it. No, I'll come back to that. You see, this is, to me, very often in posters you see Bashar al-Assad's head on top of the flag. So he is the nation. I mean, and that's not a new thing. Arab dictators have always posited themselves in those terms. But here you see him during the 2013 Opera House speech, which was really at the height of the moment when it seemed that he could go, that his position was vulnerable. And behind him is this enormous Syrian flag projected onto the screen. And of course, this Syrian flag is not a normal Syrian flag. It is a Syrian flag made up of human faces. And these human faces are not ordinary members of the Syrian population. They're soldiers who fell in the struggle to keep Bashar al-Assad in power. So he's making it quite clear who he regards as constitutive of the strength of Syria. It's not the people of Syria, it's these people. The people who fought to keep him in power. Because he is the strength of Syria. He is Taj al-Watan. He is the crown. He is the thing that will keep Syria solid, safe. And this is, of course, something that for many years a large number of Syrians might have agreed with. But the point was reached where that wasn't the case. And I will talk once we start discussing this about why I think that is. But I will close there and we can start the discussion.
Very good, very good. Thanks so much, Maher. Well, you've raised quite a number of questions and issues. One thing that, I mean, there are a number of issues that in the paper when I read it. I'm going to start with one.
Go ahead.
And that's to do with the issue of sectarianism and how the Western media, and you also alluded to it in your opening remarks, how the Western media looks at sectarian identity as the explainer for everything that's happening in the region. And you say identity, Islamic identity or sectarian identity is not destiny in the region. So can you elaborate on that? What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, I think the most important aspect of this, which gets glossed over a great deal, is that Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran specifically, as it has existed since 1979, is a power in the region. But its power has crucial limitations. And those limitations aren't really to do with sect. They are to do with the difference culturally between Persians and Arabs, and then the difference in historical experience between Persians and Arabs. And then there is the issue of sect. And the issue of sect has meant, I mean, when you talk to a standard audience in this country, I mean, obviously here I would expect a different perspective, but it is not always possible to get across to people that Shiaism is a minority phenomenon in the whole Muslim world. But not only that, it is a phenomenon that gives people a historical perspective that is different from Sunnis. But that doesn't mean it's not the same history. It's just viewed from a different angle. Now, that's before we talk about religion. But then, that historical perspective is not immutable. So that, for example, when people say to me, Shia, it's all explained by Sunni and Shia. When the Syrian war started, people had to try and invent a Syrian identity that made this explanation coherent. They had to say, the Syrians are kind of Shia. Which is nonsense. Or the Syrian regime is kind of Shia. The Syrian regime is not kind of Shia. It is not a regime built upon clericalism. It's not a regime built upon a certain understanding of the ulama's place in society, in politics. It is not the Ba'ath ideology that the Syrian state, however loosely represents, is not the ideology of Wilayat al-Faqih, which which Ayatollah Khomeini developed while he was living in exile in Najaf. So what is underlying that relationship? And the idea that the Syrians are fighting to guarantee the primacy of Iran is not, to my mind anyway, it's not a credible idea. It's certainly not, they're not fighting to further the ideology of Iran in another country. And I say that about the Syrians, but I'm not even convinced that's the case in Lebanon. And obviously, Hezbollah and Iran have a lot more religious connective tissue, ideological connective tissue than the Syrian regime and Iran do. But even there, the idea of pragmatism has to be present, and that was really the crux of the piece, was talking about are Arabs, are Persians, are Turks capable of being pragmatic political actors, or aren't they? I think if you decide that a person gets up in the morning and says, I'm Sunni, ergo I believe X, Y, Z. I'm Shia, ergo I am going to pursue this position and that position. This doesn't explain all the other things that happen in the course of a day, in the course of events. So for me, when I first was told, well, it's all about Sunnism, Shiism, if that's true, then what is happening in Egypt? Why are Turkey and Qatar on one side of this question, and Saudi Arabia and the UAE are on the other side? Aren't they all Sunnis? The Qataris and the Saudis have more in common religiously, probably, than the Qataris and the Turks do. But somehow, this became, just, you can't explain that then. How do you explain it? You have to explain it in terms of other objectives that have absolutely nothing to do with some sort of religious conception. And that was when I came back to the practical, what are we seeing? What is the shape of what we're seeing? And the shape of what we're seeing, as I said, is that these states are trying to achieve strength, but the question is, how is that strength going to be constituted? What is the constitutional basis for the state? Can it keep its inhabitants safe? Can it keep them invested in the model it's created? And to me, that was far better at explaining what I saw than Iran is bound to be on this side, Saudi Arabia is bound to be on this side. That was never the case, I don't think. And the UAE and Bahrain and all these countries have had relations with Iran in the past. But what has changed is that the Saudis feel that their model is threatened externally and internally. And when they look at Iran, they see some of the shape of that threat. Not because Iran is Shia so much, but because of what Iran has gone through in terms of revolution and change. And I'll talk about that a bit more in a minute, but I want to let you have another question.
You're on the roll, go ahead.
Well, okay. What I was going to say about the model that is put forward. When Zaki Mehshi came here from Syria, and I interviewed him for the newspaper, which I was very delighted to be able to do, Zaki talked about what he called a low equilibrium model. He said before the Syrian crisis, we had low equilibrium. And what I mean by low equilibrium is that the government used to provide free or to subsidize health, education, other basic goods. These things used to be subsidized, but at the same time, the government used to be very dominant in terms of politics. Very dominant is a nice Zaki understatement. There was really no politics except for the regime's politics. However, during the last decade, the government started to introduce new liberal policies. So it lifted subsidies on health, education, other goods, and these public goods became much more expensive for ordinary people. Remember, this is before the crisis, okay? I mean, now, as Steph was pointing out to me, the price of, and Dara, the price of everything in Syria is now rocketing at the same time that the value of the currency is collapsing. So people literally can't live. But even at that time, public goods were becoming much more expensive. At the same time this was happening, they kept control on the political side. They liberalized the economy, but they didn't liberalize the political system. And this created tension. And this didn't just happen in Syria, by the way. This happened in Egypt. This happened in Tunisia. This happened in Jordan. This happened in the Gulf countries. When I interviewed last year or 2 years ago, Jassim Hussein, who was an MP for Al-Wafa in Bahrain, came here. And I interviewed him. And Jassim is lovely and he's very understated again, but he says things like, well, there will be some improvement in the public finance, reform of the public finance. And you say to him, but if you are going to change, for example, the fact that people in the Gulf countries are taxed, we have an old saying in the West, no taxation without representation. He said, oh, but that will not happen. And it's just like that. It's just a fact. You're not going to get any input, but you're going to be asked to accept changes in the way the public finances are administered. And what happened in all these countries, I think, is that tension, the tension of people being unable to make a living and having moved away from the low equilibrium model, what I call, with a nod to the Syrian poet Nizar Qabbani, ash-shiqq al-mafrusha, what we call in Arabic the furnished apartment. The Arab regime provided you with an apartment, it furnished it for you, it provided you with your necessities, and then it said to you, now, politically speaking, you can't venture outside your apartment. Your apartment is your world. Once it stopped doing that, but then said to you, you still have to stay out of the political sphere, the tension became irreconcilable. It became impossible. And I was going to say, with due deference to Shahram, who knows much more about this than me, but it occurred to me recently, when people talk about, for example, Saudi vision to 2030, or the Aramco public offering of shares in Aramco, people say, is Prince Mohammed bin Salman the villain who cuts Khashoggi into pieces? Or is he the one who is going to change women's status in Saudi Arabia and reform the economy and all of this? He can be both these things. But this is not a choice between a bad guy and a good guy. This is a choice between the same guy who is doing these two things, not in order that one day young, educated, car-driving Saudi Arabian women will be sitting there and going, Prince, I think we should do this. Prince, I think we should do that. That is not even on his agenda. He knows that in order to liberalize the economy, he has to make these changes in order to make his economy not oil dependent anymore. But he has no intention of relinquishing the reins and the ability to cut people like Khashoggi into pieces. That's just not on his agenda. And this is true throughout the Middle East, I think. But it comes back to, and I thought about this only a few days ago, before there was an Islamic revolution in Iran, more than a decade before, there was a white revolution.
What revolution?
There was an attempt by the Shah to liberalize and modernize the economy of Iran. And in doing this, he cut across social structures. He said to the people who had been the elites of Iran, you're going to have to give up land, you're going to have to give up this and that so that people down the chain can get some living. But he also said to the ulama, land that has been held for God knows how many years in waqf, in Islamic trusts, is going to become available to people, ordinary people, to buy. And it was at that moment in 1960, 61, 62 that he upset the low equilibrium model in Iran. And it wasn't so much that could have been done and he could have gotten away with it. But when people protested, any people, when they raised their voice and said, I don't like this, or I don't like that, or this aspect of the white revolution is not good, the answer was crushing force. When Khomeini led protests saying, you can't make this is waqf land, you can't make this land, the village where he was teaching this, the armed forces went into it, killed people, and Khomeini was picked up, imprisoned, and eventually thrown out. And he started the long trajectory out of Iran to France and then back to become the ruler, to become Vilayat al-Faqih. So what began with an attempt to change the economic footing, to change the arrangement of the furnished apartment, ended up with all the furniture being destroyed. And I think that is, to some extent, on a much sort of slower scale, what is happening here. I think people who pronounce the Arab Spring dead now have to realize that between the White Revolution and the Islamic Revolution was a span of 16 years. And of course, this process continues because ordinary people in Iran may have risen up to get rid of the White Revolution and the Shah and the tyranny, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the new Leviathan, the Islamic Leviathan, the clerical Leviathan, the Vilayat al-Faqih, is acceptable to them either. And I thought it was very interesting when Sistani was asked in Iraq, how do you feel about Wilayat al-Faqih? He said, we have no problem with Wilayat al-Faqih as long as it's ratified by the population. And I said to somebody, and this is on his, by the way, you don't have to take my word for this. Sistani has a website with all his rulings on it, available at the touch of a button to people online in 7 languages. But he said this, and I said to someone, well, Khomeini would have never accepted this. You don't go to the people to ratify the rule of the jurisprudent, as it's called in English. The rule of the jurisprudent justifies itself. You know?
That's divine authority.
Yeah. And of course, within Iran, there are clerics who say we should scrap parliaments and we should scrap presidency and we should scrap all of it and we should create, what do they call it? An Islamic state. So again, we come back to this phrase. They say Dawlat Islamiyya, not Jumhuriyya Islamiyya. So how is the Leviathan to be constituted? And it's an argument that is still going on in Iran. It is still going, and it will just keep going on, because the dialogue, it's a dialogic process. It's not a process where the people finally triumph or the rulers finally triumph. It's a process where people are pushed backwards and forwards along a spectrum. But they often want the same things. People can't understand how anybody could cheer for Sisi or how anybody could cheer for Assad. But people can cheer for these things because they look at the alternatives and they think, I don't feel safe. You know, you get Christians, my barber, I'm sorry to do this, I hate anecdotal arguments, but my barber is an Iraqi Christian, okay? And he was delighted when the uprising started in Tunisia. He was even happier when it spread to Egypt. Bahrain, he was beside himself with joy. Yemen, oh, it's incredible, it's great. And all the old men who sit at the back of the barbers and never get their hair cut were with him. Yes, oh, fantastic. It's going to blow up the whole region. Oh, mumtaz. When the Syrian war started, the barbershop went very quiet. And I said, well, Namir, why is this not good as well? And I swear, I'm going to copyright this now, okay, because none of you can use it. He said this 2-word phrase to me, and it is the title of a book I'm going to do one day. He said, As-Suriya ghayr. Syria is different. And it was that got me thinking, why? Why is it different? It's the same struggle, it's the same sort of struggle. But from his perspective now, there was the question of safety. And a lot of Iraqi Christians in this country will tell you this. They will say, Wallah ya reet, I wish we had Saddam Hussein back. Why? Because Saddam Hussein was lovely? Because Saddam Hussein was nice? Because Christians loved Saddam Hussein? No. But because there was a certain minimum standard of safety which now cannot be met, which is why Christian Iraqis live outside Iraq. And they will tell you this. And for the Syrian Christian community here, and even for the Lebanese Maronite community here, some of whom grew up detesting Assad, cursing his name, cursing his father's name, when the prospect of a Syria ruled by Sunnis or even by Sunni Islamists appeared on the horizon, some of these same people who had cursed Assad on a daily basis went, Wallah. You know, they said a saying which I have to tell you became very prevalent at this time, and it's now prevalent. You still hear it. They said in Arabic, بدك تأكل عنب ولا بدك تقاتل الناطور. Do you want to enjoy the grapes, or do you want to kill the watchman who guards the grapes, the vines? Natur is a very interesting word. I mean, basically in Arabic, I use the word natur, I mean a janitor, right? But a caretaker is probably more accurate. He's the caretaker of the state. And they said, Wallah, you can't throw him. So there was a young woman in my office whose parents were Maronites. And she said, no, my parents will be delighted. They hate Assad. I said, go and ask them. She said, no, I know, I don't have to ask. I said, go and ask them. She went and asked them, and they were like, no, Assad must stay. She said, I don't understand. I said, I said, this is where it gets really interesting. This is where it gets really interesting. And this is what I meant by religion is not destiny. Somebody would have said to you, this is the Maronite Christian position. Not anymore. The same Maronites make a pragmatic calculation. Hamas, a Sunni organization, makes a pragmatic calculation. It says we cannot be part of the effort to suppress the rising because our own constituency will not understand what we are doing. It makes a decision not based on the fact that Syria and Iran have been its patrons for years. It makes a decision based on the needs of its constituents. That is not a decision that is dictated by Sunni theology or whether you are Hanafi or Shafi'i or whether any of these things. It is a decision made in the wind of politics.
Maher, I think you picked at my list of questions. My next question would have been about the relationship between minority groups and the attitude towards power, towards democracy, and why. And you have another anecdote in your piece where you talk about meeting a family on train journey in Spain, I think.
That's right.
Egyptian family.
That's right.
And you talk about what's happening with Sisi and Morsi, and they're Christian, and they say the Coptic Christians from Egypt, and they prefer obviously Sisi, and what does that tell us about the social contract?
It might even have been before that. It might have been they might have preferred Mubarak even. Well, I mean, I think particularly from a minority perspective, this problem has existed now, I would say, for hundreds of years in the Middle East, not just now. But it's a problem that has become more and more exacting for minorities as new states have formed, because new states have to work out different relationship. I remember when Assad was trying to reground himself in the middle of the conflict, and he had a new constitution drafted, and he held, even in the middle of Syria torn apart by war, he went through the rigmarole of holding a referendum to ratify this constitution. And as I said, Christians in Syria, by this point, many Christians and many Alawites, and again, I don't believe that the Alawites automatically looked at Assad and said, we must back him. Again, it's a pragmatic calculation. But many of them voted in the areas where they could vote to ratify the constitution. But many Christians at the same time expressed an objection to the constitution because there was an article in it that said the president of the Republic of Syria must be a Muslim. And they were like, well, we thought that Syria was for all Syrians. Isn't that was because at the same time, at the same time as this constitution was being passed, the Assad regime was putting out we are the people who transcend sectarian boundaries. We are the people who stand for all Syrians. We don't just represent Sunni Islamists or jihad or any of this. We represent everybody, Christian, Alawite, everything. Shi'i or Sunni, there is no division, there is no sectarianism. But then you were told, no, the president has to be a Muslim. Why does the president have to be a Muslim? And this almost created a wobble in that constituency. They were like, well, I want the constitution changed. But these people didn't understand the purpose of the exercise. The purpose of the exercise was not to give them an actual input into the situation. The purpose of the exercise was to say to the outside world, and so much of what goes in Syria has been pitched to an outside audience. Even the protests, when the protesters in Kifr Nibil write their signs in perfect English, they're pitching to the outside audience. They're saying to the outside audience, please be engaged. And it's even more than that. It's not just English. They write things like, I remember when James Gandolfini died suddenly, the star of The Sopranos, they had a thing saying, we're very sorry James Gandolfini died, please support us here in Syria. And I thought, these people are reaching out for any point of contact to say to people, we are human beings like you, please don't just stand aside and watch us die, right? At the same time, Assad is saying to people outside, look, I'm fighting the jihad, the same crazy jihad, the same long-bearded nutcases that you're fighting everywhere. Please back me. Please back my trans-sectarian, trans-Syrian constitution. And it's much like, again, I come back to the Saudi Vision 2030 idea. He says, well, I will let women drive, so please give me your support. Please back my project. I'm the Leviathan you've been looking for. I'm the Leviathan you're hunting for. I'm the big animal who is going to guarantee safety and prosperity in this corner of the world. And this is what the Constitution was about too. It was never about making everybody feel comfortable. It was about saying to everybody, well, this is my position and I'm not going to retreat from it. So that is what happened. But always minorities in the Middle East have faced this choice, and it's a choice that I sort of elaborate on in the essay using a 3-word phrase. The choice between a more just state and more just states, you know? And you have this now, you see this in Syria. The idea that perhaps the best way to defend Kurds in Syria is for them to have a separate entity, Rojava, okay? Or perhaps the best way, and I mean, the French proposed this to the Alawites. They said, why don't you have a separate state on the coast? They even did postage stamps for it. You know, I years ago, a cushion cover came into my possession which had been done of a marriage between 2 Alawites, and it had covered on it Alawite postage stamps from the Alawite Republic, which lived for, you know, it was a bubble, existed for a few years in the 1920s, but they had appliqued these stamps into the cushion cover. And I thought, here we are at this moment when there could be a separate entity, but there wasn't. And of course, in the essay, as I say, Israel is kind of the classic case. Because of course, the Zionist argument was, if Jews are in a minority in a country and they're a tolerated minority, they can never truly be safe. They have to be the masters of their own destiny. And in order for them to be masters of their own destiny, they must have a separate national entity. They must have that. You know? The problem is now that we are watching at the kind of, at the state level, this question coming up for every community. Is it better for us to go this way or that way? Do we rely on the patronage, the power of the Leviathan, or do we try and be our own Leviathan? Can we do this? Can we form our own entity? And of course, for most of these minorities, that's simply not possible. It's not practical. For the Kurds, there is an outside possibility of it being practical, but for example, for the Yazidis, it's simply inconceivable. And yet, the Yazidis here, and I remember this very distinctly, when Peter Dutton went to see them, and we wrote a Good Weekend story about it, he was thanked on behalf of the Yazidi nation. And I thought, well, this is very new. This is a people who are a sect and have always been a sect. There's never been a time in history that they can point back to and say, then we were a nation. Conceiving of themselves for presentation to an outside power in national terms and saying, here we are. Where would that boundary be of such a nation? When the Syrian conflict was, when the Kurdish referendum was going on 2 years ago, I spoke to a young man who lectures at Melbourne University, and he was like, well, the Kurds can have their nation, but we need an Assyrian nation too. And it's like, but you'll be fighting over the same territory, essentially. You know, who is going to draw the imaginary boundary between this Assyrian nation and this Kurdish nation? Mm-hmm. And then it keeps going, you know? What about Assyrians who don't identify as Assyrian? What are they going to do? You know? And it becomes micro and micro and micro and micro. Mm-hmm. It becomes almost impossible to conceive of the level of balkanization that would go on. Mm-hmm. And of course people they say to you, well, this kind of Leviathan is really impossible. You know, when I interviewed the Israeli journalist Ari Shafiq when he came here, and I quote him in the piece, he said, the one-state solution won't work in Syria. The one-state solution won't work in Iraq. The one-state solution can't work in the Holy Land. And it was like we had argued backwards from Zionism so that all the states of the region were no longer satisfactory. But then what do? You know? You can't go back to the world that my father inhabited in the late 50s and early 60s, where people dreamt one morning of waking up and the whole Arab world, from Rabat to Baghdad, was one country. Or maybe you can. But at the moment, we're at the other end of that pendulum. We're at a point in the pendulum where people form their tiny little states and say, this is the basis. Like Mahfouz's alleyways. Mm-hmm. My alleyway is my world.
Yeah. Fantastic. I am mindful of the time, and I'm going to reserve my questions for later on, maybe private chat. So I would like to open the floor to questions, if there are any that you'd like to share, or observations with Maher. Question at the back. Sarah, please. Can you press the button so, yeah, that's better.
I'm Hussein, delighted to be here. Thank you very much, Maher. I'm Syrian myself. My name is Dara. I'm a PhD student here. My question is with regard, I was born in the United Arab Emirates. My question is with regard to the change in the direction of the Gulf region with regard to the relationships with Israel.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you can explain a little bit on that and in relation to what you were just saying. Thank you.
Well, it's I grew up in, I spent half of my childhood in Dubai, 7 years. And I can remember a time when people who stayed in hotels in the Gulf, in Kuwait or in Dubai or in Abu Dhabi, on the receipt when they got their bill at the end of the hotel stay, there would be a line at the bottom after the total price, the Palestine contribution, and people, whether they liked it or not, had to give a certain amount of money that went on their hotel bill. And this was to support the Palestinian cause. Not every hotel did this, of course, but quite a number did. And of course, at one time, certainly in the 60s and 70s, for all of these Gulf countries, it was an article of faith that the Palestinian community was to be supported and so on. The problem is the political reality now, and I speak as a Palestinian, which is that we are still stateless. And if you don't have a state, you don't count. And we are learning this not just in the Middle East, we're learning this everywhere in the world. If you don't have a state, and you are a population, what I call an ill-fitting population, if you don't fit into the state you are in, and let's face it, for obvious reasons, we don't fit into the Zionist state, or not all of us anyway. A certain number are allowed, but not beyond that. Then if you are an ill-fitting population, then you simply don't count in these calculations. Whereas states like to deal with other states, right? And from the Emirates perspective and from the Saudi perspective, when their hold on their populations was threatened by this process of wanting more input, they needed to find someone who would support them in being the controllers, because their control was a dependable, a known factor, whereas if you suddenly throw it open to the whole population, it's not clear what would the political perspective, even with Egypt this was true, what would the political perspective of Egypt be if Egypt was a full democracy? The West doesn't know, and that makes it nervous. Whereas it knows that if it has a dictator in charge of Egypt, there is a certain degree of predictability in the position, right? The same is true with the Saudis, same is true with the UAE. They've developed these relationships over long decades, and now they want to keep those relationships. And from that point of view, Israel then becomes a natural fit in the relationship. Israel is all about, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, okay, we're told again and again. But it has another identity, which is not talked about nearly so much. And that identity is that for more than 70 years, it has been a securitized state which rules over a stateless population, right? Now, there is a clear analogy there with the situation of the Saudis and the Emiratis. Yes, they are ruling over their own kind, but they are ruling over them in a securitized state where that population don't have input into governance. So the position of the Palestinian population vis-a-vis Israel is the same position of an Emirati or a Saudi vis-a-vis his own government. Until very recently. I mean, now the Emiratis, some of them get to vote in local administrative assemblies, right? But even then, the franchise is not clearly, the basis for the franchise is not clear. I remember the elderly gentleman who ran the first election said, my own mother doesn't have the vote and I can't explain to her why. You know? Because it was ad hoc, right? You are not expected to have input, right? So these states look to Israel and say, well, this state also has a population that they guard 24 hours a day with monitoring and everything. So we are looking to them. And it's not just Israel, by the way. That relationship is there and it's been developed secretly for some time. But now, Xi Jinping went to the Middle East and said, I'm willing to give you $1 billion yuan, $200 US, to ensure social stability projects What does he mean by social stability projects? He means the kind of electronic monitoring that the Chinese are now leading the world in. Facial recognition technology. I mean, obviously we know. We did a story in my newspaper about how Bahrain buys some of the facial recognition technology it uses from this country. But the Chinese ultimately will become the leaders in that field because they have far more people to monitor. And they have their own ill-fitting population, the people in Tibet, the people in Xinjiang, who they want to keep completely under 24-hour day, 7-day a week, 365-day a year watch. So from the point of view of the Gulf Arabs, that is where we are at. We are at a point where we now need to be able to monitor every person who constitutes our population. And in order to do that, we need people who know about monitoring. And who knows about monitoring better than the Israelis? Who knows about monitoring better than Beijing? Nobody. So we will go to them and we will talk to them. And for them, it's a mutually reinforcing interest. Because the Israelis don't actually want democracy in any of these countries because they can't be sure of the position, right? When Egypt went through its revolution, countries all over the world went, the brave Egyptian people. The Israeli diplomatic corps were told by their government, stay silent, don't talk, don't say anything. The Americans, for a while, struggled with their messaging. You know, Frank Wisner went to Egypt, and on the way back, he said, of course we'll support Mubarak. And Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were like, what are you opening your mouth for? That's not the government's position. They actually dressed him down before he got back to Washington and said, this is not the position of the government. The government supports the people of Egypt and their self-determination. So suddenly the American position changed. But the Israeli position does not change. So the Israeli position was, because they're a regional, they're not abroad, worried about public opinion, they're in the region. So they said to their diplomats, you don't talk about the Egyptian revolution, you don't say whether you like it or you don't like it, you just keep out of it. And you sit there and hope that the status quo will be maintained, right? But as on top of that, there is that realization from the Chinese especially, that if they were terrified by the Arab Spring, the Chinese, they even, during the Tunisian revolution, the word jasmine was blocked on Chinese social media. You couldn't type it, you couldn't refer to jasmine in any context. That word was barred. Why? Because the Chinese, and the Russians as well, of course, lie awake at night worrying about color revolutions, what they call color revolutions. So there is a mutual reinforcing thing here. The Saudis need those kinds of friends. And sadly for us, the Israelis are in the business of monitoring, nanotechnology, all these surveillance technologies. And that's the basis for the relationship.
Yes.
I'm Marie Pesosnowski. I publish some of my work at the University of Melbourne now. A bit of a broader question. I've got no issues at all with what you're saying academically. I guess broader in terms of media, it seems too good an opportunity to waste having you here.
Go ahead.
I guess, what you're saying is applicable across the board, not just in the Middle East, in terms of the social contract. It's a constant negotiation between people and the state, or however that's comprised. But yet the media seems, as you said in the beginning, to be so much interested in these binaries and very simplistic arguments. And here in academia, we're trying, we're most of the time, if we're doing it properly, we're the furthest end of the spectrum away from that. So I guess a two-barrel question, what can the media itself do to kind of get away from those simplistic arguments? And then also, I guess, how can academics contribute to those kind of arguments as well, I guess?
Well, first of all, I would say that I think initiatives like the conversation where, I always like to think that, people can knock on my door, and if they can write, then I will happily look at it from a feature perspective. But I'm speaking as one editor at one newspaper. Initiatives like the conversation, I think, are productive because I think it's very, very important. The main barrier, I think, between academic writing and academic publishing and newspaper writing and newspaper publishing is one of language. Put very simply. After 25 years working in newspapers, always my first problem with academic writing is vocabulary. The layman, I'm not suggesting that this is a question of intelligence. It's not. The layman needs things explained to him in a certain way, and the laywoman for that matter. And quite often, academics, like newspaper people, there is a jargon within newspapers as well, is used to being understood in a vocabulary that is very different. I once banned someone I knew from using the word discourse while she talked to me, to see where we went, right? But discourse is just one word, and I think most of our readers, fingers crossed, can handle the word discourse. But what I'm talking about is the necessity to put ideas into a comprehensible form. And I think the conversation represents part of that effort, but I think it has to be much broader, much broader. What I would say about the capacity of media, obviously we live in times where newspaper media, my sector of the media in particular, makes a lot less money than it once did. And that is evidenced in cuts to the number of staff that we have, although at the moment the age is hiring. But what I would say about that is one of the things, and I said this to Shahram just before we came in, and I have no shame in saying this, it is now several years since we had a Middle East correspondent. Our last Middle East correspondent was Ruth Pollard, and when Shahram talked about Walkleys, Ruth won a Walkley for her reporting from Ghazni, but at the same time she could so easily have won a Walkley for her reporting from the north of Iraq, from Syria. She stood at one point, and I have to say I stayed awake all night that night. She was 150 meters from the front line when Islamic State were at Abu Ghraib. At one point, the Islamic State forces advanced to Abu Ghraib and were within sight of Baghdad. And she said to me, "I can see the black flag." And I thought to myself, what have I done? I approved sending her there. I approved her doing this reporting. And now she is, a few hundred meters away from these people who are killers, and who, with a Western journalist, are not going to even hesitate, right? So for me, if we don't have a Middle East correspondent, we don't have eyes, right? We have the perspective of the American newspapers and the British newspapers. And to me, the American newspapers and the British newspapers are, by their very nature, flawed perspectives, fundamentally flawed. And I would say, when you talk about binaries, one of the reasons, as you said, this is something that is true in lots of regions, this disconnect between people and their representatives. It's happening in Britain, my own, where I was born and grew up. This argument over whether or not we can be adequately represented by the EU or not, and whether we are willing to give some of our sovereignty to the EU in return for certain benefits, it is essentially the same argument, right? And now we're talking about, can we rely on Parliament to represent our needs and wants? Or do the British people have to now develop some kind of post-parliamentary form of government, right? Executive rule by Boris Johnson. So these arguments are common, but what's different in the Middle East, I think, sadly, is a long history in the West of caricatures of Middle Eastern people, of racist simplifications about what Middle Eastern people are and what they can do, of pathologization, particularly of Middle Eastern men, so that Middle Eastern men are racially pathologized, religiously pathologized, even sexually pathologized. Middle Eastern man is a certain kind of man, he has certain base motivations, and you can't change that, right? That is the problem is that whenever we try and talk about political sophistication, whenever we try and talk about the same processes that are going on in the rest of the world, vis-a-vis sovereignty, vis-a-vis the nation state, vis-a-vis economic liberalization, we get, well, the Arabs are crazy. They're not like other people. They're fanatical. They've got thousands of years of history just stored up in their memories, and they're just bursting with it, You don't ever hear this. Maybe you do, I don't know. But you don't hear it nearly as much. When Serbs talk about Kosovo, the Battle of Kosovo, which happened, in 1389, or when even, whisper it, when Zionists talk about the Maccabees, you don't get anybody saying, this is bonkers, right? This kind of historical reach. But when Arabs do it, they're automatically written off. This was, you're talking about the Stone Age, you're talking about the Dark Ages. You're talking about our history here, You know? If a British person talks about the Norman conquest, that is not a sign that they're insane. If, on the other hand, they try and build a political program on the Norman conquest, then sure, But this is one of the reasons it's difficult in the media. It's because people have basic triggers around Arabs and around Iranians and around Turks as well. But they also have triggers around even words in these languages. So that when you hear the word jihad, people bring all these associations with it automatically. When you hear the word sharia, automatically, all of these associations are with it. And now it's stretching. When I first came to this country in 2003, after the September 11th attacks, a man, a sub-editor, chief sub-editor, came into my office and said to me, "What is takfir?" And I had to stop myself from talking because I thought, I don't want to tell him something incorrect. I need to go away and find out myself what I'm going to say. But suddenly we're worrying about takfir, we're worrying about, and one of my current favorites, and this is very relevant to this, when you go to protests by Reclaim Australia or by One Nation or whatever, you see, Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb. And people say, you see, the Muslims believe that their land is Dar al-Islam and that everywhere else they should be at war with them because it's Dar al-Harb. This is such a fundamental misunderstanding of the basis of this division that you can hardly even, it blew my brain off. And this is what is meant by Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb. Hobbes says, wherever there is not a Leviathan, there will be the war of all against all. Everybody will be at war. There will be no dependable security. This is what Islam says. Islam says where there is rule according to Islamic principles, there will be peace and there will be enlightenment and so on and so forth. Never mind that we are falling so far short of this now. Where there is not proper Islamic principles, there will be harb. And harb does not mean in this context Muslims waging war against non-Muslims. It means there will just be disorder, chaos, strife.
Anarchy. Yeah.
Anarchy, fawda, chaos. When an Arab talks about Muslims going to war justly against non-Muslims, they talk about jihad, not harb. Harb is disorder, it's messy and unruly. So it's precisely the Hobbesian division. There is the world where people give up a bit of their freedom and get stability in return. And then there is the world where you don't know who is going to be the one that stabs you to death. That is the division. That is Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb. Yet you have young people out there going, I live in Dar al-Harb. You are going to kill me. And it's like, you don't understand what you're talking about. But these understandings are fastened into the minds of people and you can't unfasten them. So you have to go back to the vocabulary level. And I say to people, if you are not sure about what an Arabic word means, please don't use it in copy. Please use the English equivalent, because we are an English newspaper. And we don't need to create misunderstandings about words in other languages. We're already doing pretty well in English, so let's stay in English. But it is true that I think that this problem is a universal problem. It's everywhere that there are states. But in the Arab world, there's the added layer of difficulty that the West has spent such a long time talking about us in these negative, disparaging terms. And this is before we get onto the subject of how an Arab or a Muslim woman speaks up in a Western context. Because that is even more, that's like 3 more twists on the problem, I'm so proud when I look around and see Muslim women in this country speaking up and holding forth in debates. And I honestly sometimes think that I'm not necessary. I just can sit back and let these people have it. But I'm also constantly conscious of the baggage that these young women especially have to encounter when they say, we know what your situation is. No, you don't know what your situation is. You don't. Sorry, I got on a bit of a rant there.
That's great, Maher. That's great. Any other questions? Yes, Nemat.
Thank you. I'm Nemat Levani and I work at the ADI here in Pakistan. I wonder if you could comment a little more on the ability of the Islamists to recover from those 2001 Arab Spring and
Can you press the
experience of Egypt in particular.
It's good.
In particular, like how, for several decades, the Muslim Brotherhood was trying to create a Leviathan outside the state of Egypt and create all the social services. creating some kind of social safety nets outside the state, and with the experience of the election and failure in Egypt, how do we look like looking forward that they can recover from?
I think, and this is true not just of, I mean, obviously there's a difference between the Islamism of the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, this is another thing that in the Western media you have to be so careful. When we say Islamist, you are covering such a wide range of ideas and phenomena. And then you get people who just, I had an argument with one of my own colleagues who said that the Muslim Brotherhood became Al-Qaeda. And I said, well, how did it become Al-Qaeda? It simply didn't. That's not true. It's historically inaccurate. Forget ideologically, it's historically inaccurate. But you have the Brotherhood, you have other Islamic movements that are civil Islamic movements, and then you have Islamism going into a spectrum, and then beyond Al-Qaeda you have this Islamic State, which is even for the members of Al-Qaeda problematic. So you have this very wide spectrum. Now to me, the Brotherhood, as you said, tried to form a Leviathan outside the state, and that allowed the state often to portray it as a giant kind of conspiracy, a giant kind of, shadowy, Masonic kind of organization, in much the same way that Erdogan now does with the Gulen movement. He points to the Gulen movement and says they put people everywhere. They're in the police, they're in academia, they're in, they're everywhere. They've infiltrated everything. And the Brotherhood is like this. Egyptians talk about, the Brotherhood, he is an Ikhwani, he is in this organization, he's in that organization. So yes, they did try and form a Leviathan outside the state, and of course, as you say, through social services, in much the same way that Hamas did, in much the same way, I should say, that the Islamists in Algeria did. And one of the biggest factors in the Algerian Islamists winning the election in the early 90s, which had to be suddenly aborted, was that after the big earthquake in Algeria in the late 80s, they had gone into villages and provided more effective help than the government. And this happens in Lebanon too. When the 2006 war took place, the reconstruction was done by Hezbollah. The government couldn't compete, right? So the rebuilding, the social structures, the safety net was provided from outside. The problem is once you become government, you have to be able to incorporate, and if you are serious about being a democratic government, if you want to be a government like Sisi or like Mubarak, then you don't actually have to go to the outside constituency. You just have to make sure that things run smoothly for them. Now, we can argue about the extent to which the Muslim Brotherhood was economic forces within Egypt who were keen to see the old regime returned, sabotaged the Muslim Brotherhood's attempt to govern the country. That's certainly there. There's no doubt that happened, in my mind. But at the same time, the Muslim Brotherhood failed because if you are serious about being a democratic government, you have to be able to reach out to people who are not like you. You have to. And they proved fundamentally unable to do that. Their sense of the optics of the situation as well was very bad. When you put someone who has been connected with terrorist violence in charge of the governorate of Luxor and say, this is the new governor, what kind of message are you sending? You are tone deaf. You are being tone deaf. You have to put someone in charge of Luxor who is not associated with any of that violence of those days. It's not only whether or not he's a changed man or any of this rubbish, it's the appearance of it that matters. And you needed to make sure that Egyptians understood that you were serious and committed to that process of inclusion. At too many moments when the Brotherhood needed to make a message of real, strong bridging the gap, it went back into its own fold. It became introverted. And that was fatal. Because at the moment when it needed help, when Tamarrud was going around mobilizing, and I have to say, one of my big disagreements with Julia Al-Yashar, who says it doesn't matter whether Tamarrud was a bunch of dupes. It does matter whether they're a bunch of dupes. They were essentially a bunch of dupes, in my view. Well, they may well have been well-intentioned, but they were still duped. She says, it doesn't. But one of the things was that when Tamarrud was mobilizing, the Muslim Brotherhood needed to say to everybody, let's stay on the same page, let's stay on the democratic page. They couldn't do that because by then people said, you yourself don't behave properly. You yourself don't govern for everybody. And the Muslim Brotherhood really didn't have much of a comeback to that. They were in a weak position to start with. They weakened it further through their own actions. And then at the same time, people were working uphill against them. Whether they can recover that position depends on their ability, and I say this at the end of the essay, but it depends on their ability to say to themselves, our strength is in diversity. Our strength is in reaching out to people like us. It does not weaken us if we form a coalition with Copts, with secular Egyptians, with leftists, with Naserists. But the Muslim Brotherhood is in the habit of saying, I can rely only on these people. When the oppressor came, when the jailer came, when the torturer came, these are the people, these are my brothers and sisters. I can't rely on outsiders. It has to be able to change that mindset if it's going to come back. And the same is true for the AKP. If the AKP survives the Erdogan experience, it will only be able to establish itself by reaching out to other constituencies. The very constituencies that Erdogan started reaching out to. Kurds, secularists, leftists. If it can't do this, then it's ultimately doomed. It lost the Gulenists, but it will keep losing people. You know, it doesn't matter how strong Erdogan is. You know, he can't hold the whole thing together just through will. It has to go well as well. And when the Egyptian economy, when the wheels fell off, there was nowhere for the Muslim Brotherhood to go. And the same thing, when the Turkish economy eventually goes upside down, Erdogan will also find that his failure to reach out and his failure to be inclusive is his doom. And it's not un-Islamic to be inclusive. Quite the opposite. You know, it is a sign of strength to be inclusive. So, to me, that's the challenge for the Brotherhood. If they can't meet that challenge, then somebody else will meet it. And they'll be left behind. They'll become a shell. In the same way that so many movements have become a shell in the Arab world. So many nationalist movements, so many religious movements have become shells.
Well, Maher, I think, did you have a last question? Or okay, so Maher is going to stay with us over lunch and we can have chats and conversations. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for sharing your insights. Obviously, Middle East is such a difficult nut to crack for many of us. So many different factors at play. But I think if there is one lesson that we all have to take away from this conversation is that we need to be able to say it clearly and succinctly and avoid jargon, which is not just a problem for journalists, but also a problem for academics.
Absolutely.
We do tend to use a lot of jargon in our writing, so we're not going to be able to reach out and convey the message if we don't write simply.
But I think as well, I mean, I don't know whether this has seemed very dark, this prognosis, but I am not, I mean, it's very difficult to watch. The carnage in Syria has been horrible and continues to be horrible, and it breaks your heart. Every day I see something that leaves me in just despair. Or I hear about something that leaves me in despair, and it's hard not to despair when you look at Yemen as well, and when you look even at the situation in the occupied territories, and you look at the situation in Egypt. But I think of Emil Habibi, who was a Palestinian writer, and I think of his ideas about optimism and pessimism. And basically, people don't go anywhere. States without people aren't possible. And whether people's attitudes, people's hopes don't go anywhere. What happens is that they are sometimes like the hopes that Langston Hughes talks about. If a dream is deferred, you know, it stays there. And that means sometimes that it can explode and cause violence, or it can be realized, the dream, but later than people expect. And I think that the position of the people who constituted the Arab Spring, the people who drove it, yes, they're outside the Arab world, a lot of them now. But my father was was outside the Arab world for a very long time. And the dream that he had is the same dream these people had, right? So the dream didn't go anywhere. What happened was that a generation, and perhaps this generation too, is going to be like my father's generation, and a lot of them are going to grow up far away from the war, but their feelings about it won't change. And the dialogue that they have with the people inside won't change. So I'm optimistic, but I'm optimistic over a much longer time frame. Over the current time frame, it's like Habibi says, pesoptimism. You become pessimistic and optimistic at the same time.
Well, let's keep the dream alive.
Oh.
Thank you, Maher.